Well, hi everyone, and welcome back to the Engage podcast. Hello, Peter.
Hello, James. Good to see you.
You've just shaved.
I have.
Yeah,
I have.
You were looking quite slovenly.
Was I?
Well, that was your word. You said that to me. You said, "I'll just
sluggish." I think was my word.
You said, "I'll just go and shave because I don't look appropriate enough for the podcast." Because the Engage podcast demands the highest possible standards.
Absolutely.
Of sartorial elegance and perfection.
You've had your makeup done.
When we finally hit the big time, we will have a makeup artist. We'll probably have one each, to be honest with you. When this podcast really kind of hits the airwaves in an even bigger way than it currently. I mean, it's already doing really well. We're delighted with the response.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And for all of you watching and listening, thank you so much. And I hope it is useful and helpful because that is the goal and the heart behind it. But yes, anyway, well shaved, sir. Well turned out, and I think appropriate as well because we are returning to talk about an issue that we discussed together just a few weeks ago, but we're going to come back to again. So why are we coming back to it?
Well, you haven't yet said.
I'm letting you do that. It's a tease, you see.
I was wondering if it's going to be one of your magnificent transitions again, James Transition Mildred. We are returning to the issue of assisted suicide. That is in light of the publication, finally, of the terminally ill adults end of life bill put forward by Kim Ledbetter, which is to be debated on the 29th of November. The text was published on the evening of Monday, the 11th of November. So we can finally now see what is being put forward. There's been a lot of talk about what potential safeguards were going to be. Kim Ledbetter had said they're going to be the strictest in the world. Well, now we can see whether or not that is actually accurate.
Yeah, and it's also worth saying that the publication of this bill is a good thing because it's right that members of Parliament have an opportunity to actually scrutinise the detail of the legislation before they then have to debate and most likely vote in it on November 29th when this bill has its second reading. But it has taken quite a while for this text to be published. The bill was first introduced in Parliament on the 16th of October. Well, that was almost a month ago. And Kim Ledbetter announced she was bringing forward an assisted suicide bill at the end of September when she came number one in the private member's bill ballot. So, in other words, we've had about 6 weeks of waiting, and the amount of time that MPs now have to scrutinise what I think is one of the most profound changes to medical law, ethical law change that this country has seen in generations. They will have the grand total, if you go from Monday, for example, I think of about 17 or 18 days to scrutinise something as significant as this. So I think on a point of process, glad the bill's here, but my goodness, it really could have done with being published earlier.
And as we have noted before, the fact that they're only going to have 5 hours to debate it as well.
Yes.
So I completely agree. It is an absolute earth-shattering development if the law does change. How on earth can you make a decision based off such little argumentation? So
here's an argument, though, that I think will be heard increasingly in the coming days. We work for CARE, we're Christians, we're opposed to this bill, as are many, many others, and I think an increasing number of MPs are coming off the fence and going, actually, we don't want to do this. But the argument might come back from some of the MPs supporting this bill. Oh, we get it. You want more time to scrutinise it. You want more time to consider the legislation in detail. Well, we'll vote it through at second reading because then it goes to committee, and that is where a public bill committee will scrutinise it line by line, and then it will have report stage, and then it will have a third reading, so we can come together again and debate it again, and then it's got to go all the way through the House of Lords before it even receives royal assent. So what's the answer to that line of reasoning? And this, by the way, was employed by one of the bill's sponsors, Christine Jardine, who was on the BBC, I think, just last night. And she said, effectively, just send it to committee, as if that will solve everything. So what's the answer to that?
Well, I think part of the problem with that is second reading is often seen as the point in the process at which the principle of something is agreed.
Yeah.
So if this passes at second reading, well, then people who are putting the bill forward will then say, well, we can't possibly backtrack on the principle of it now because MPs have agreed with that.
Yes.
So I think there's a real danger with that line of argumentation. And it was interesting. I think I saw Kim Ledbetter herself tweet out the other day, if MPs are unsure what to do with this bill, they should support it.
Yeah.
That is absolutely mind-boggling.
Yeah. On the one hand, like, I can understand that if it was sort of we're making a minor change to how our railways operate, I might have a little bit more sympathy. But we are talking about a bill to empower the state to legally help patients in certain circumstances to kill themselves.
Yeah, like you do not do, oh, well, if you're unsure, then let's play with life and death.
Yeah, that's right.
Like, the stakes don't get higher than that.
No.
I thought it was absolutely insane. I mean, surely it is the exact reverse to that.
Yes.
If you're unsure, keep the status quo. And of course, ironically, that was one of the big arguments in the whole Brexit referendum years ago.
That's right.
If you're unsure, keep the status quo. Certainly in a case with life and death, you absolutely do that.
But to me, this speaks to a really worrying pattern that we've seen from Kim Ledbetter. Now, I don't know her personally. I know people who do know her. And by all accounts, she is a well-liked member of Parliament.
Yeah.
She's never really shown any interest in this issue prior to introducing this bill. I know she came under huge pressure from Number 10 because the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, supports law change and made a promise to Esther Rantzen.
Indeed.
We know all of that. At the same time, since introducing this bill, she argued in a Guardian article that many people in this country face an agonising choice between a really difficult death and painful death or spending thousands of pounds and going to Dignitas in Switzerland.
Yeah.
Well, that's a false choice. She's then come out and said that this is the strictest assisted suicide bill in the world. Well, even if that is technically true in terms of the number of safeguards, that is not a defence of the fact that many of the safeguards in here, as we'll discuss, don't work.
Yeah.
And then the third thing that she's done is say this whole line of, oh, if you're unsure, just come off the fence. And do you know what? Let's just take a punt. It'll be all right.
Yeah.
That's staggering.
Yeah, and actually on the safeguards point, and I know that we'll probably come on to talk in much more detail about the specific safeguards, this bill really is not that different to other bills which have been put forward before. And certainly to say, well, it would have the strictest safeguards in the world, I would say is at best misleading. And if not, actually almost coming close to downright deceptive. The reality is that most bills around the world where countries have adopted legislation have started off with a bill like this, and then they have loosened those safeguards. So to say, oh, it has the strictest safeguards in the world, well, yeah, that's because the other countries have got rid of them.
Indeed. And in fact, just to add to my frustration with how Kim has conducted herself, I think there was also a moment where effectively what she said was, if MPs pass this version of the bill and then it gets through all its stages and receives royal assent, then Parliament's will have been settled, and so there won't be another kind of vote on this, for a while. In other words, denying that there could be calls for expansion almost as soon as you pass this. And of course, that's a fundamental failure to understand how parliamentary process works. You don't need to have another terminally ill adults end of life bill to expand it. You can wait for a massive government health bill, for example, and put an amendment down to it. Or you can wait for another bill where it's deemed in scope, could be on another topic altogether. And again, you go via the amendment route. So the idea that somehow pass this and everything will be okay, this will be it, we know from other countries that that's not true. Yeah. I make one other point as well, which is I do want to comment on the title of the bill. This infuriates me. So I think it's got worse, not better. So I think pro-assisted suicide campaigners have moved from calling it assisted dying bill and failing to get that passed. And so their latest idea is get rid of that language altogether. You'll notice in this bill title, terminally ill adults end of life bill, the word dying is completely absent. And assisted dying bill is misleading because it's not, it's assisted suicide. This is an even more egregious attempt in my mind to use euphemistic language to soften what is actually being proposed. Terminally ill adults end of life bill, that could mean anything. This bill could be about trying to make sure that they really do get palliative care, or that we just make some tweaks to medical codes of practice to make sure that they receive medications at this time and not at this time. But instead, they have completely hidden away the reality of what really is being proposed here with a title that is soft, misleading. And again, it's that sense of this is so disingenuous.
Yeah, and actually picking up on something you said there, we have often talked about how it is assisted suicide, not assisted dying. The pretense sort of actually slips in the very first sentence after the contents. So the very first sentence is eligibility to be provided with lawful assistance to voluntarily end own life. If you were just using those final 4 words, voluntarily end own life, we have a word for that.
It's called suicide.
And that word is suicide.
That's right.
It is not assisted dying, it is suicide.
Yeah.
And the bill sort of talks about how actually the act which will have to be amended is the Suicide Act.
Yeah.
Because this is assisted suicide.
Yeah.
And so that I thought was really interesting. There is no way around this, which gets away from the fact that this is about inflicting your own death upon yourself. One other point before we kind of get into the weeds of the bill. Kim Ledbetter has described what she is trying to do as shortening death rather than ending life. That doesn't seem to me to be what is happening. What do you think?
I just despair. I mean, it is just deception, because actually the two, shortening death, not ending life. What are you talking about? Because shortening death, ending life, both will end in the same way, which is you will die. And actually, no one is denying that legalizing assisted suicide will do anything other than shorten death in terms of the process, because you will not die of the condition that you have, the illness that you have. You will die because the lethal drugs that you will take, or that are administered or given to you to self-administer, I should say, will paralyze your nervous system and stop your heart from beating. That's why you will die. So in that sense, yes, it will shorten death. But this idea of drawing this contrast of shortening death, and it's not about ending of life. Well, it absolutely is about the ending of life. That's the whole point of this bill. So it's deception yet again.
Yes, and actually to pick up on something you said there, I think there is a real danger of this being conflated, in principle, with the kind of palliative care, which we think is a good thing, where actually you try to make someone comfortable at the very end of your life, and actually the drugs you give them might sort of slightly hasten them coming to a natural end.
And an end that is the result of the illness with which they've gone into hospital.
Exactly. Whereas this is giving someone a lethal drug to end their life there and then.
Yes.
And the two are not the same at all. This is not about making someone comfortable. This is about pressing a button, which will end someone's life.
That's right. Well, let's get in then to the safeguards thing, because the entire debate on the 29th of November will rest on this issue. Are MPs persuaded that the safeguards in this bill will actually work? Are they persuaded enough that enough of them will work? Or do they come down of the view that actually there's no amount of safeguards that can make sure that no case of abuse, exploitation or coercion will take place? And that is why they've made such a big deal about the safeguards, because that's what the debate's going to come down to. So number one, so this is a 38-page bill, and the clause number 1 is simply called assisted dying. So that's the first time the word dying, apart from in the table of contents, has come up. And it's immediately telling us that this is only going to be applied to a terminally ill adult who is registered with a GP in England and Wales and who has lived here for 12 months or more. And straight away, I can foresee a problem, which is, well, 2 problems actually. First, by starting off with such a narrow set of criteria, you are creating immediately a situation where people are going to go, well, if it works for them and it's all about choice for them, why not expand that choice to someone who's terminally ill and has 12 months or less to live, or 24 months? Or why does it just have to be limited to someone with a terminal illness? What about people with such severe depression that life really seems to have lost meaning for them? Why not apply it to them? So that's the first problem. The second problem with this is, ask any doctor and they will tell you it is notoriously difficult to get it right when it comes to prognosis. That is, how much longer do we think you will have to live? I've experienced this myself. When my dad was in a care home and he'd just been moved there, we were talked to a doctor, we were given a rough time scale that turned out to be wrong. Now, I don't blame the doctor, because I know enough about doctors' lives in medicine, and I've talked to John Wyatt enough to know this is really difficult. So immediately we're already into problems here.
Yes, and actually the kind of crucial bit, actually, I think on prognosis comes in the second point, doesn't it? In the bill, which talks about the person's death has to be reasonably expected within a 6-month time frame.
Yes.
The reality is that doctors do have a reasonable idea when someone is in their final few hours or days. They cannot forecast 6 months ahead. And the amount of people who have been forecast, say you've got 6 months to live and actually live for years and years, is really pretty staggering. So this is not a safeguard in any meaningful way. It means a whole load of people who might not have otherwise died within 6 months might voluntarily choose to take their own life well ahead of their time.
Yeah, exactly. So that's just point one, and we're already into difficulty. I think then it goes on to talk about terminal illness, as you've said, and then it's got a thing about capacity. I mean, I think it goes without saying that the capacity element is important, as in it is right that patients should have capacity to make such a massive choice. But again, it's a little bit misleading because this speaks to a broader point. I think pro-assisted suicide proponents often talk as if people with 6 months or less to live are able to make an entirely rational decision, an autonomous rational decision about ending their own life. And I would question that because I imagine that there must be a whole load of pressures on that individual, emotional pressures, social pressures, environmental pressures, maybe family pressures as well. The idea that there's this fantasy world where we're all rational actors able to make this kind of call without any pressure on us, I think it's just fantasy yet again.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably right. I was reading something the other day which made what, in hindsight, seems like a really obvious point, but I hadn't necessarily considered it before, which is if you receive a terminal illness, surely at that point in your life, you are more likely to, say, have depression than at other points in your life.
Yes.
So I agree. To what extent are you able to really make a truly rational decision? And the second part is, if you know you've only got less than 6 months to be living, and say you are in a care home and it's costing quite a lot of money, as care homes do in England, well, then, I mean, surely there is going to be part of you which is thinking, well, wouldn't it just be easier for my family and my friends if actually I saved that money and was able to pass it down to them?
Absolutely.
Because of course it is.
Yes.
And so, and I guess the statistic actually, which I think I've read before, is in Oregon, which is held up normally as one of the really good examples of a jurisdiction where assisted suicide is supposed to be working well, according to proponents. I think in Oregon, 53% of people said that they chose assisted suicide because they didn't want to be a burden on their family or friends. That 53% was higher than the percentage of people who said they wanted assisted suicide because of the pain they were in. So clearly this is a massive issue.
And that's a really important point because, again, this is often presented to us as if, and Kim Ledbetter did this in a Guardian article, this is about stopping people from suffering with huge pain at the end of their life. Well, if in Oregon, after years of the law being in place, the stats and the reports are telling us that people aren't choosing assisted suicide primarily because of unbearable pain, because pain can be managed. They're choosing it for lots of other reasons. The next bit I want to highlight is, to my mind, one of the most dangerous parts of this bill. So clause 4, initial discussions with registered medical practitioners. And it starts off well that no registered medical practitioner is under any duty to raise the subject of the provision of assistance in accordance with this act with a person. Well, good, quite right too. But nothing in subsection 1 prevents a registered medical practitioner exercising their professional judgment to decide if and when it is appropriate to discuss the matter with the person. In other words, notwithstanding clause 1, there might be a scenario where a doctor might come to you and you've never raised or even breathed the words assisted suicide. They've not even entered your subconscious thought. And that doctor, because in their professional opinion, it is worth making you aware of this, is being empowered to start that conversation with you. I cannot stress this enough. That is terrifying. That is scary. And that is going to fundamentally change the doctor-patient relationship in the most damaging of ways. Imagine being on the receiving end of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I mean, it's horrific.
And I agree that is one of the worst things in this bill, to be honest. It's certainly some of the worst stories we have heard from what's happening in Canada have begun where a doctor has raised the prospect of assisted suicide with someone who wouldn't have otherwise considered it. And I also agree with you about the whole idea of changing the doctor-patient relationship. So we ought to imagine a scenario where hypothetically, say that there are some doctors who are massively in favour of assisted suicide. And we know that there are some because in other places around the world, there are some. So obviously many doctors are opposed, but some are massively in support of assisted suicide. Well, in that case, they are likely to say this to lots of people who would fit within this kind of 6 months criteria. Now, imagine again, and this doesn't take much imagining, that the NHS is on its knees, that there are league tables being proposed about waiting times for your local hospital, which again actually was in the news in the last couple of days. It is really not beyond the realms of imagination at all that some doctors who might be ideologically in favour of assisted suicide might think this is a way for my hospital to actually function properly, or this is how actually we can save some money. Of course it's not out of the realms of possibility to think of that.
Yeah, and I mean, so one of the ways they try to sort of safeguard the initial conversation that the patient would have with a registered medical practitioner is they say that, the registered medical practitioner, having conducted a preliminary discussion, they've got to be able to explain and discuss with the patient the person's diagnosis and prognosis, any treatment available, the likely effect of it, and any available palliative, hospice, or other care, including symptom management and psychological support. In other words, they're supposed to say there are other options for you. Now, on the one hand, you could say, well, it's good that is in there, and yes, it is good that it's in there. On the other hand, that leaves you at the mercy of the expertise of the doctor in question. And my experience with GPs is that they are excellent, doing fantastic work, all power and credit to them, but they are, by their very nature, expected to be a jack of all trades and may well lack expertise in some of these areas. The provision of palliative care is a specialist provision. We have doctors who specialize in that. And so if that GP has, again, ideological views on ranges of treatments or their own personal views on diagnosis and prognosis, it is inconceivable that won't inform some of the advice that they give, even if there are codes of practice put in place. And so, again, I think this is a big issue with this bill, is it leaves you at the mercy of doctors. It empowers doctors, and it will empower judges as well. And inevitably, there's an element of subjectivity in all of this. So that's another example where I think they put something in that looks good, but when you press it and when you prod it, you realize, hold on, is this really as safe as they're suggesting?
So then picking up actually on that conversation between a doctor and a patient, the subject of coercion is something which has been in the news for the last couple of days. So how would a doctor be able to tell whether someone was being pressured into choosing an assisted suicide or not? There was a really, in some ways, quite enlightening interview, I would have said, between Victoria Derbyshire and I think it was Christine Jardine, Lib Dem MP in Edinburgh, where Victoria Derbyshire tries to press Christine Jardine on this. How is a doctor going to know whether someone has been coerced or not? Because effectively doctors are not trained in spotting signs of coercion. And the question was asked 4 times, and there basically was no answer. Answer came there none. Christine Jardine tried to talk about all kinds of other things, but she couldn't answer the question, how is a doctor going to know? Because there isn't an answer.
That is precisely the point. This is the biggest stone in the shoe. It's the weakest part of the entire argument, is that they have done their level best. They've even got a section, clause 26, dishonesty, coercion or pressure, and they've made it an offence if there's any evidence of this. But the point is that coercion often happens and there is no evidence. And you can't tell just by talking to the patient. It's the same idea with domestic abuse. It happens out of sight, behind closed doors.
Completely. So, and you particularly cannot talk to the patient in something like this where the result is assisted suicide, because they're not there for you to talk to them. So I think it is really, really flawed.
Yes, absolutely. There's a couple of other matters as well that I think, again, it's just worth pointing out. So obviously, there's a whole rigmarole around. You've got a first doctor assessment, and you've got a second independent doctor's assessment, and then there's some another independent doctor will give a second opinion if it's needed in certain circumstances. And then you go to the court approval. And this is where you need to basically go to the High Court and you need to say, well, this is the application for an assisted suicide. And the High Court then is expected to kind of make a adjudication on this. Now, there was some working out that was done to say, well, if you took Oregon as the model and look at the scale of assisted suicides in Oregon, because Slippery Slope has two elements, numbers will always increase year by year and the range of categories and eligibility is expanded. In Oregon, the numbers have gone up. So if you take it now and you work out, okay, what's the equivalent over here at the current rate in Oregon, you would be looking at around about 400 requests. Yeah. I think on an annual basis, something like that, or possibly
for each judge.
For each judge. Now, bear in mind that our justice system is creaking at its seams. Bear in mind that it is still dealing with a massive backlog after COVID. And bear in mind that this will only end up becoming a rubber stamping exercise, where in effect, judges just go, yep, stamp, move on. Yep, stamp, move on. We're talking about people's lives. And you can just see how easily this could go wrong. And again, people may say, oh, it's just scaremongering, it's fear-mongering. I don't think it is. I think we already have a problem where justice is not swift enough in this country unless the entirety of Number 10 and Whitehall make sure justice is swift. So we saw that with the rioters in the summer. But it took an enormous amount of institutional movement to make that happen. And I think this is a recipe for disaster, that the High Court is already dealing with a backlog and are going to really, really struggle. But the other aspect of this is, again, it places an enormous power in the hands of High Court judges. Yeah. Is it right that they should be the ones deciding who shall live?
And will they have the time to kind of fully consider each of these?
Well, that's exactly right.
You touched there on process-wise about the opinion of a second medical practitioner. Actually, it was interesting, I think, because I think I'm right in saying that there are concerns that second practitioner doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a doctor. It could end up being as simple as a pharmacist.
Yes.
And the other issue with it is, whereas you have to be registered with your first practitioner for 12 months before they can say yes, with the second practitioner, there's not really anything adequately which stops, if that practitioner says no, which stops you from going around and trying to find another one or another one.
Yes,
so effectively assisted suicide shopping.
Yes, that's right. Until you find a doctor who approves your request.
Exactly.
And what will happen, because we've seen this happen when it comes to abortion, is that certain doctors who are ideologically committed to this will become known for being ideologically committed.
Completely.
And you will go to them as opposed to just going to the nearest available independent doctor.
You go to one who signs it off.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. I think there's other kind of questions that I've got about the legislation. So one of the things I noticed from going through the bill was the fact that in terms of family involvement, then that is limited to basically, if the doctor thinks it's appropriate, they should advise the patient to consider discussing the request for assisted suicide with their next of kin. I mean, I find that staggering as well, because you're basically saying there that you don't need to talk to your family about this. So you might make the decision. Your family might be utterly and implacably opposed to that decision. And in our society, because we've elevated autonomy so highly, our response to that is to go, well, it's what the patient wants. I say, what are you talking about? Like, if the family are opposed, they've got to be part of the discussion, because we're not an island. No man is an island. We're made for community. Yeah. So that's a big concern that I've got in terms of the family involvement. And then the other thing I would just say is the whole section around the provision of drugs. There's nothing really in here about what will they do if the drugs don't work, which does happen in some situations. Complications may occur. And what's happened in Belgium is there was a horrendous story of a woman who was arranged to be euthanized, and the doctor came and the nurses were there and the drug didn't work. And so what the doctor and the nurses did was they took a pillow and they suffocated her to make sure that her request was fulfilled. But sorry, I thought this was all about dying with dignity. There didn't seem to me to be anything dignified about that death at all. And so that's another concern that I have around how this will actually work in practice.
Yes, and actually, similarly to that, I don't know whether you saw the story from a couple of weeks ago about the new suicide pod in Switzerland.
Yes.
Which was being used for the first time. Currently, it is being investigated by the Swiss authorities. Because there are concerns that the American woman who tried to use the new suicide pod has strangulation marks around her neck. So it is not unheard of for things to go wrong with this at all.
No, here's something else as well, which I picked up from, again, going through the bill in detail. There's this one-sided approach to appeals. So if the High Court says no to your request for an assisted suicide, then you can go to the Court of Appeal and you can appeal that particular decision. But if the High Court approves the decision, then there's no comparable process for, say, the family to go through to say, actually, maybe we're aware of abuse from a neighbour or a friend or even someone else who's come into our loved one's life from the outside. And so we want to stop this. And so we're going to go to there's no way that they can do that. And so again, this all is pushing people. And I must say this because it does seem to me that from a Christian point of view, what makes this so terrifying is, and this is why I find it so difficult when Christians support assisted suicide out of a laudable desire to stop suffering, is I want to say to them, do you know what you're saying? You're saying that you support something that will prematurely usher that individual into eternity to meet their maker. And that spiritual and eternal dimension is we don't really talk about it because we do all of our work in a public square that would not listen to any of that. But to a Christian audience, you want to say but that's just the opposite of sort of what we believe in terms of we want to give people every opportunity to repent, to believe in Jesus. We don't want to hasten their death in any way at all and mean that they go into eternity unprepared. So I think that angle as well, although that doesn't come out in the bill, obviously. I'd be amazed if it did. But so I think, problem after problem after problem after problem.
You can tell, I think, that we don't like this bill very much.
No.
Are there any redeeming features?
No.
Because I agree.
Because the fundamental flaw with assisted suicide, it is morally and ethically wrong. Yeah. It is an immoral act. And again, I understand why people passionately want to do something about suffering. I can connect with that. I understand too why people are afraid of a difficult death. I can connect with that as well. I'm afraid of a bad death. I mean, as I look to the future and I think, what happens if I get this or that or the other? Of course, there's part of me that's afraid. But there are answers to all of that. And I tweeted out this week that actually, when you stop and think about it, what are the safeguards designed to do? The safeguards that we've just basically gone through and gone, they won't work. But they're supposed to work by making sure that the patient is kept safe from abuse and exploitation. Isn't palliative care the ultimate safeguard?
Completely.
Isn't that the best way of protecting them from abuse and exploitation?
I mean, similarly, I completely understand the desire to help to alleviate suffering. That is a thoroughly good impulse. But I think it's John Wyatt who says, biblical thought always draws a distinction between removing suffering and removing the sufferer. The two do not go hand in hand. And so we have to come up with a better route for solving problems around suffering, and that has got to be palliative care.
Yes.
Helping people to feel more comfortable in body, mind, and spirit, because all of those are important when it is coming to the end of life. And actually, even we've sort of briefly touched on this, even when it's not just around the end of life, because often I think the most tricky cases around suffering are not relating to terminal illness or sort of a 6-month related to terminal illness. It is the person with Parkinson's or it's the person with MND who has more than 6 months to live. And we need to come up with solutions in terms of how we treat people like that with dignity.
Yes.
Rather than just focusing all our thinking around the final 6 months of someone's life. And you said at the start, like this bill would be expanded. It absolutely would be, because the worst cases of suffering generally are not just the ones at end of life.
That's right. And I think there's another interesting sort of thing going on at the moment, which is, so I think when this bill was introduced, the vibe and the feeling was, the time has come. Parliament has changed dramatically. 335 new MPs, many of them Labour. They're going to want to vote this through. The Prime Minister's in favour. Let's go. And then ever since that moment, you've just had a series of interventions. The Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, came out and said, I'm really not sure about this. I'm on the fence. That's unusual for me. Then he came out and said, I'm going to vote against. The Justice Secretary said she would vote against. That's the two ministries responsible for implementing this bill saying no. You then had the Chief Secretary to the Treasury come out and say, I'm going to vote against this bill. And actually then, even just in the last 24 hours, you've had the Health Secretary go on the radio and say, assisted suicide is not in the NHS and departmental budget. So we would have to find the money to make this scheme happen from somewhere. And if we did that, other NHS services would suffer as a result. In other words, they would have to take money from other parts of the NHS, cancer treatment maybe, palliative care provision most likely, something else like that, and they would have to reorientate it towards providing assisted suicide. And so he's now doubled down. He's come out with his strongest line so far, saying, I am absolutely voting against this. And so all of a sudden, you've just begun to get a sense of actually maybe this bill will be rejected by MPs on the 29th of November. Have you picked up anything in that vein?
I think the feeling which I am picking up is actually comparatively optimistic in our favour, which is well, I guess a real answer to prayer, isn't it? And so I agree. I mean, when Labour were elected with such a landslide, given that historically Labour would not be seen as the party on life issues, regardless of whether or not that's fair, the feeling at that point was much more negative. And I was speaking to people who were saying, oh, well, guaranteed it's going to come in. It is absolutely not guaranteed. And actually, I think the tide is more in our favour than anything else. And there was I think it was probably part of Newsnight last night where the political correspondent was saying actually he thought that support for this bill was ebbing away.
Yes. Well, I mean, I've thought for a while that Starmer has made a tactical error here.
I agree.
I think that, two things I want to say quickly. One is I think he's pushed this too soon.
Agree.
Secondly, while it's possible that we will win on the 29th of November, if you're watching and listening, please keep praying and keep contacting your MP. And if your MP hasn't responded to your initial email or letter or request for a meeting, go again. Try and get a meeting with them. Send another email to them. Be kind, be gracious, but be persistent. And even if this fails, that does not mean that we will not see another attempt in the lifetime of this Labour government. Because Parliament will end at some point. We'll have a new parliamentary session. The King will come and open a new session, and we'll go through the whole private members bill rigmarole all over again. But also, if the government does introduce a major NHS or healthcare bill, it is primed for an amendment to be put down to try to legalise some form of assisted suicide. And that could be in either the House of Commons or the House of Lords. So the way I'm saying is we might win the battle on the 29th of November, but the war, I mean, it's a horrible turn of phrase to use, but the war in terms of defending life and resisting something as dangerous as assisted suicide absolutely goes on. And in fact, a colleague just this morning was reminding us, we've been talking about this in terms of the House of Commons in England and Wales for about a month. In Scotland, this has been a live issue for 2 years. And that rumbles on. And the committee are meeting in January to take more oral evidence. Stage 1 debate in Scotland of the assisted suicide bill there will happen probably in the spring. And again, it's looking interesting. I think you could see the same thing play out. But the message to everyone is keep writing, keep praying, and let's see if we can see this off.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I am feeling, I think, far more optimistic than I was. I think you are starting to get people who are being public about their opposition. So, for instance, Nigel Farage was on record the other day saying he is going to vote against this bill.
Unlike his colleague, deputy leader.
Unlike Richard Tice. Diane Abbott.
Yes.
Came out and said she would vote against this bill, and she's sort of, I guess, old school Labour, right? On the side of those who are the poorest.
Ed Davies against it, leader of the Liberal Democrats. Tim Farron, prominent Christian MPs against it. Less as a surprise, but still important. I've also seen other Labour MPs who aren't Christian saying, I just can't go with this. I have too many questions, too many concerns. And in 2015, when the last assisted suicide bill was debated in the House of Commons at second reading, the thing that swung it was the number of MPs who said, I'm just not convinced the safeguards will work. Nothing has changed? Nothing.
Yeah.
And so actually we find ourselves in a similar position, and I think I will be urging with all power that I have and influence that I have, which is pretty considerable actually, Peter, I will be urging as many MPs as possible to vote against this bill.
I think the interesting thing is, I think my suspicion is that quite a lot of MPs are not against the principle of the bill, but they are against the prospect of abuse, and B, the sort of its introduction at this particular time, and so I think those I think are the key attack lines. Safeguards will not hold, and the time is not now because the NHS is on its knees. And we do not yet have proper palliative care, and so I think there is a real prospect of seeing this off.
Tomorrow's battle, as it were, will be if palliative care is invested in and does improve.
Then it's fighting about the principle.
Then it's the principle. And we will continue to hold the same ground, which is this is in principle wrong. But I agree, I think there's a number of MPs who perhaps are more sympathetic in principle, but I think on this occasion will vote against. It's worth saying, if you're watching this and you want to think more about this topic and understand more about it, please do head to our website, care.org.uk, where we have an entire resource hub dedicated to assisted suicide in the topics section. You'll find a primer video from yourself about what's wrong with assisted suicide. You'll find an article about the roots of palliative care, which was created by a Christian. You'll find a fantastic story from a former colleague of mine who watched her husband die, and she speaks very movingly about that experience, plus other interviews and 10 things you should know about assisted suicide, resources you should know, 7 ways to pray, etc., etc. And you can visit our Take Action function as well, and within moments you can have this beautifully crafted email ready to go to your MP that you can edit to make it personal, and then God willing they'll reply. So I mean, loads for us to do in the next few weeks. We need to pray, we need to act, and we need to hope and trust that this bill will be defeated.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we've done it again. You see, last time you threw me, because I think you started doing my end of podcast patter, and I was like, what in the world is going on? So I want to say, we're almost becoming like the two Ronnies. I often think that. Do you know who the two Ronnies are? So patronising. Yes. The two Ronnies are. I know it's not our generation, but they were. But they got that great routine at the end. It's a good night from me, and it's a good night from him. I kind of feel like we should develop our own version of that.
Okay.
What do you reckon? Not for this podcast.
Because we haven't planned it.
But maybe when I make my comeback in January, maybe that's the time. I should say, depending on how things go, you might not see me on a couple of episodes. It's not because of any other reason than my wife is very, very, very close to giving birth to our first baby. So if that happens, there may be a surprise guest on the podcast. There may be. And anyway, I'll be back for definite. I'll be back in January. Fantastic. So that's very exciting. Peter, it's been great to be with you.
Always good to be with you too.
And look forward to catching up with you soon.
Very good.
See you later.
Bye.